everybody. Welcome to UNA Greater Lincolnshire in September 2022. We're delighted to welcome Jane Salt, who's one of our trustees, to lead this session on gender, Sustainable Development Goal 5. I'm sure we'll be exploring a full range of issues around gender, but by way of background, I've known Jane for some time, and although an educational background in primary and junior, has also been involved in inspecting schools as part of the UK inspection frameworks, and in her own right is truly a good golfer. So there's a bit about the person there. There's also about the background she comes from, and I'm delighted to ask her to lead us out tonight and raise some challenges and some thoughts on this topic. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Clive. I'll just start sharing my PowerPoint in a moment. I'd just like to say that what I shall be doing tonight is exploring some of the gender equality issues that have been raised by the United Nations as part of the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, and hopefully try to enable us to think more personally about what we can do, how it affects us locally as well as globally. So I hope you'll bear with me and have some reflections that you may wish to share later on. So I'll try with my, oh dear, it's not, there it is. So that is my screen, and is that fine with everybody? I think it should be, shouldn't it? So in the light of recent events, I felt that it was quite important to start with a woman who has just received worldwide acclaim for a role which she has carried out for 70 years. And I think it's been quite an unusual week running up to tonight. Our Queen's long reign of 70 years represents a monarchy of more than 1,000 years since William the Conqueror, when queens only reigned when there was no other choice, and they often reigned only with the support of powerful men. And I think it's quite interesting to think about how much things have changed over that period of time, but how many of those things are only relatively recent changes. When our Queen came to the throne, she came as a young woman with 2 small children in quite a man's world. And if you look at photographs of the time, she is surrounded by male politicians, world leaders, and business people in general. As our new Queen consort said over the last few days, she had to carve out her own role. And in her own way, she's promoted the role of women throughout her reign, starting when she was only 18, before she actually came to the throne, with her army service during World War II. I don't suppose many young women at that time could say that they were an army driver and could strip an engine, for example. She also, in a quiet way, promoted women through things she said and things that she did. She made a famous speech to the WI in 2015, noting the changes in women's achievements in terms of being able to vote, climbing Everest, and even at that time we'd had a female prime minister. And through their own efforts, she noted that women have more opportunities and play a greater part in all areas of public life. She was also instrumental in making changes to the succession to the Crown Act, so that there are now equal rights for sons and daughters to take the throne, rather than what went before, which was eldest son, and even if he was younger than his sister, would take precedence. She also educated her own children away from the palace, which apparently caused much consternation with her mother, who thought that it was a dreadful thing to be doing, to be sending the children out into the world. But this has continued, and I think our youngest generation of royals are educated in quite an ordinary way. But I think my favourite anecdote about the Queen making a small point in her own way was when, visited by Saudi prince, offered him a tour around the estate, and he hopped into the Land Rover, into the passenger seat, and was quite horrified to see the Queen take the wheel. And I understand that partway round a rather racy tour, his interpreter had to ask her to slow down and concentrate a little more on the driving. So there are many ways that she may have had influence, and obviously had many contacts globally. And I'm sure one of her contacts would have been Nehru, Prime Minister of India, between 1950 and 1964. This is a quote that I first heard from my grandfather when I was a teenager. If you educate a man, you educate an individual. However, if you educate a woman, you educate a whole family. And I think it's a good sentiment. And although I didn't really think about it at the time, I do wonder whether it actually suggests a bit of gender bias by assuming that men don't generally have anything to do with the upbringing of their children. Women were able to vote in India in January 1950. There was universal suffrage in post-colonial India. And so clearly this represents a lot of positive moves, but I think what we need to explore is how deep they go and how fragile they are, or how well established they are. Thinking about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, this particular slide is a reminder that there have been many breakthroughs, but some of them are pretty recent. I'll focus on these particular areas because I had to try and make this large subject a manageable sort of size for the time we have available. So here we've got a comment that in national political leadership, it will take another 40 years if we continue at the same rate to reach equality or an equal representation. The women's share in national parliament, it's still only just over a quarter. A big concern is about girls at risk of child marriage, and particularly as a result of COVID-19, how this has set back or increased issues around this particular area, and also in terms of violence against women. So those are the areas that I shall look at specifically. It doesn't exclude other areas you may wish to sort of think about as we progress. A key area is then the right to vote and to be able to register choice. And women need to be able to vote unpressured. In 1897, Millicent Fawcett started the National Union of Women's Suffrage in this country. And this photograph just shows what she was up against. I think there probably was quite a lot of progress pre-World War I, but during World War I, women entered the workplace by necessity because so many of the men were either away at war or went away and didn't return. And I think that was quite a turning point in many respects, which allowed women to play a larger part in some of the political and more decision-making situations. But again, you can see from this archived photo, women's will beats Asquith's won't. There's still a lot of barriers that were very openly displayed for women to have to overcome. And in fact, in order to do that, they had to win over men to help them make progress. The Representation of the People Act in 1918 gave women who owned property some voting rights. But of course, also at that time, we need to remember when we're talking about gender equality, it plays both ways, because at that time, not all men were allowed to vote either. So we have to put it in the context of the time. It set me thinking about the last 100 years. The Representation of the People Act in 1918 was the first big step, but it took another 10 years for the Equal Franchise Act, which allowed women equal voting at 21, which at the time, thinking of a much smaller population than we have at the moment, gave 15 million women the right to vote, which is quite substantial, perhaps, when you think about it in the context of the time. But then look how long it took for any further steps to be made. It took till the Representation of the People Act in 1969 to bring the voting age down to 18. Now you might wonder what the strip of numbers are at the bottom. It set me thinking about my personal situation. I have been fortunate with a long living family that I have known my great grandmother, who was born in 1886 on the left of that strip, my grandmother who was born 1909, my mum 1932, I'm the 1956 one, and my daughter is the 1985 date. My great grandmother didn't get the chance to vote till she was in her 40s. My grandmother and mother my grandmother had no voting rights at birth, and the first general election that she was able to vote in was 1931. And although my mum was born with voting rights, her first general election was 1953. When I was born, my voting right, like everybody else, was 21, and I was one of the very first who were able to vote at 18. So in that 100 years, my daughter is the only one who was born with voting rights at 18. My first thought was, oh, goodness me, that's not very, that's taken a long time to get sorted out. And then I started looking at other European countries. So beyond the UK, I particularly picked up on Belgium, where women were not allowed to vote till 1948, in Greece 1952, and in Switzerland a surprising 1971 for federal voting. These days, most countries, women are able to vote, but often face other constraints. And thinking about the anecdote with the Queen, only recently women in Saudi Arabia have been allowed to drive. So over 100 years, it appears there's been quite a lot of progress, but it's taken a long time just to get there, hasn't it? It also made me reflect that it can be very fragile and it can change quickly for good and bad. And over the last 60 years in Afghanistan, we've had a pendulum swinging, and we know that it's a very difficult time for the country. Obviously, it's highly dependent on the political regime that pertains at the time, but votes for women in 1965 were revoked in 1996 and then reinstated again in 2002, and the pendulum has swung yet again to the point where women can't work outside the home or leave the home without a male chaperone, and that girls' education stops at the equivalent of our year 6. And it rather closes down all the opportunities for women to be participants in leadership roles or political decision making. And I think that picture says it all, really. 1970s on the left and the 2020s on the right. And I think really what we need to remember is that if women have no voting rights, there's no participation in government, and women are less likely to be in any sort of managerial positions. Excuse me. that led me to be thinking about women in leadership roles, and in particular in political roles, and becoming an MP. Nancy Astor became the first female MP in 1919, but if you look at the graph, right up to 2019, we're still at only 34%. And that, if I refer you back to one of the earlier slides, the United Nations data suggests it will take another 40 years. You know, we've had quite a long run at this, but over 15-year jumps, it's only increased by another 10% or so. And COVID hasn't necessarily helped the situation because, as we'll perhaps explore a bit later on, women's roles have been affected by it one way or another in the workplace quite significantly. On the positive side, the UK has had 3 female prime ministers now, which, you know, when you think about the number of prime ministers we've had over the last, well, since 1919 perhaps, then that's perhaps quite a positive thing. In terms of workforce participation, what I found here in the House of Commons Library was some pretty recent data based on last year, and there were 15 million women, and they count women as age 16 plus in the workplace, and they looked at the employment rate, the pay rates, and how many women were in the top jobs, and by top jobs they measured it through the FTSE top 500 companies. That's probably quite a narrow group, but I think it illustrates the point here that the difference in the percentage of men and women in the workplace is relatively small at 6%. But when you look at the median pay per week, that has grown to 14%, and women who are in jobs which may be high paying, the percentage difference has grown to nearly 30%. Trying to also take into account that most part-time workers are women, and that there are also some gender-related issues, that just serves to exaggerate some of these areas. Bringing it back to a sort of more personal level, perhaps you'd think about your own families as well. My grandmother worked in a munitions factory during World War II. She had to leave when men returned because the men reclaimed their jobs. Before that, before she was married with a child, she was a nurse. But after leaving the munitions factory, she couldn't return to that either because she was a married woman. And one might think that things changed after World War II, but they didn't, not quickly. My mother told me once, to my horror, that when she became pregnant for the first time from her clerical job, she was lucky to have a job, and she was only allowed it because she worked in the back office and nobody could see her. And the previous job that she had to resign when she got married because they just didn't employ married women. So we're talking there about the early 50s, which I know, you know, is getting further and further away, but it's still within our sort of living memory that these things were happening, and the changes that maybe pushed things along didn't start perhaps until the 60s, when things started to move along a wee bit quicker. I found it interesting looking at some of the employment by occupation. You can see an equal number, or, you know, it's a balance at the top with the professional occupations, perhaps a little bit smaller proportion of ladies who reach managers, directors or senior officials. But when you sort of go down a little bit further, not many women have skilled trades, but they do have a lot more administrative and secretarial jobs. Men tend to operate plant and machinery. Women tend to do a lot more caring and that sort of thing, and also tend to be in the groups that are slightly lower paid. I think an interesting question here is, do we need to be careful not to stereotype in an adverse way? And are there really jobs that are better done by a specific gender? There are some arguments there, aren't there, about what is appropriate or possible. You know, that if you need certain physical characteristics to be able to do a job that is physically demanding, then it may not be for all women. At the same time, there may be jobs that women are more suited to, but we need to be careful not to develop a context where people are excluded on the grounds of gender. And as I say, we've got to be careful that it plays both ways there. In terms of women in the workforce, I think the UK does quite well, but I did find some interesting data on other parts of the world, and you can see there's quite a difference between Iceland at the top with 79% of their women in the workforce and Costa Rica with only 46. What interested me most was that and I know this is quite a small print on this slide, but Scandinavian countries tend to be at the top end. I do know that quite a few of the Scandinavian countries have very good deals for paternity leave, and that may be one of the factors. The UK comes in, you know, pretty high, as I've said, and just below the UK, there is Japan, Australia, Eastern Europe, and the USA comes in just above, surprisingly, the EU, which is obviously when all 27 countries are taken into account. Central and South America tend to be the lowest number of women in the workplace. I tried to find some data on developing countries because there were suggestions that this would be even lower, but I think it may be difficult to measure because of the type of work and the type of living conditions, that maybe you know, some jobs or some work is more casual, cash-based, not registered, and that would be something that I would perhaps spend some more time having a look into. Maybe some of you know. What it does raise the question, though, when looking at some of this data, do women have to be exceptional to get into leadership positions? And I thought, well, let's have a look at some women who have achieved in, you know, things that people see as quite exceptional. Don't know whether you recognise all four of these ladies. I suspect that that you will, or at least you'll perhaps recognise a couple of them. They're 4 examples from different walks of life, providing leadership and having achieved in their field. I guess they would all come in the professional bracket, not necessarily paid highly. They all face challenges reaching the positions, and 3 of the 4 experienced sexism, discrimination to varying but considerable degrees. So just in case you're not sure who they were, we've got Malala Yousafzai, who I presume that you will all be aware of. She is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and she's an activist for female education, having been shot in the head for supporting girls' right to education. Karen Brady, you may recognise top left. first came to prominence as the managing director for Birmingham City Football Club, which was a role that I think at the time, and even now, would be a very unusual one for a woman. But she proved very capable. But the sort of climate that she was working in, she had a lot of challenges that she had to overcome that people now would see as having to put up with abusive behaviour. I hope you won't mind me using the example that I think illustrates it quite well. But apparently when she got onto the players' bus one Saturday, one of the players from the back shouted, "I can see your tits from here." And these days that would be regarded as totally unacceptable, but not at the time. However, she did have the presence of mind to tell the offending person, "When I sell you to Crewe, you won't be able to see them from there." And within a month, she'd sold him to Crewe. Top right is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a Jewish immigrant who rose to great respect through the judicial system in the States. She became a Supreme Court judge. She faced both racism and sexism, and even in her own community, she was not supported. She had no bat mitzvah because of the orthodox beliefs regarding females reading from the Torah. And so that was one of the things that spurred her on to become a gender equality activist. And the story that I felt was very sad for her was that on achieving a high office, she discovered that she was being paid a lot less than her male compatriots, and the reason she was given was, "Well, your husband has got a very good job, we don't need to pay you so much." Hopefully that wouldn't happen now. The other lady you may not recognise, but she's somebody who we found out more about during COVID, because she was the designer of the Oxford vaccine. And she faced a different challenge, but has managed, with the support of her husband, to overcome expectations. She had triplets, and the assumption was that it was going to really affect her career. But in fact, her husband decided that he would take on the main carer role in order for her to continue her work. And I think we ought to be all grateful that he did. There are obviously many other reasons why women don't or can't achieve. There are barriers and challenges, and some of it is discrimination, some is unequal opportunities, limitations in education, social pressures, and sometimes protected characteristics, which are well defined in the Equality Act. Another barrier that the UN are very concerned about is created by the concern of child marriage, because it can cause women to be restricted at a young age, and therefore they can't develop educationally or mature through life experience, because they've been forced into a situation very early. Many women, I think, in Western countries these days are choosing to delay marriage or childbearing in favour of establishing their career. And I think, you know, certainly as a woman, I can relate to that. Bringing it to a personal level, I can remember my mum saying to me, "You can have it all, but not at the same time." And you have to make choices which sometimes can be quite difficult. And I see this, I have seen it a lot, particularly in my more recent working life, when I've had long conversations with young women who are in positions like head teachers or senior leaders in schools having to balance very carefully their work-life proportions. That's not to say that all men don't have to change that. I think we are seeing some culture change where sharing of different aspects of home life are enabling this to happen, but the challenges are still there. And I think society still assumes that women are going to be main carers, which leads to certain expectations. However, on the subject of child marriage, the sort of things that it can lead to is one of the important things about education, that early marriage might lead to education not being completed or extended, and therefore potential not being reached. It doesn't mean that education is not available later on, but maybe you lose time, or it just makes it a harder journey. And I think that that's one of the sort of key areas that we need to be always very mindful of, that education unlocks doors, and anything that closes those doors needs to be addressed. Another fear for child marriage is early pregnancy, because of what it can do to women physically, young women, if they're not ready to take on pregnancy. High rates of mental health problems and increased risks of those things, violence, poverty and isolation, are very serious things to have to cope with much later on in life, and these risks need to be removed where possible. Also the concern that child marriage could be forced marriage, and I think it's something we could all be vigilant about. I think data also suggests that when girls are educated to a higher level, it's much less likely to lead to child marriage, because they have choices that they can make, and they also have reached a greater level of maturity and don't find themselves as vulnerable to outside influences. There is a UNICEF resource called the Manual on Social Norms and Change, which I've had a look at, and it does make an interesting read. It talks about from gender equality to shared positive social norms. It also talks about legislation and transformative collective consensus. If you want to change the world, start at home. And I think whilst a lot of the data that's used is from on a global perspective, we do need to be very mindful about keeping an eye on what's happening at home, because it's sometimes things are quite surprising. For example, we think that, well, it's easy to assume that Western values are in some way better or more progressive than in other parts of the world, particularly the developing world. But when, and to an extent, maybe the highest incidence of child marriage is in developing countries, but it's quite worrying to learn that in the USA, 15 states have no minimum age requirement for marriage. And I think the thing that is even more worrying is that if a girl is under 14, a judge's consent is required and given. One assumes that, if that's part of the law, then consent is given from time to time. And I think we need to be aware that we're not just talking about developing countries, we are talking about societies that we in this country might feel very aligned to. With issues like this, education obviously is very important and may help, but without legal protection, young women and girls remain at risk. And it's all very well changing a law, but you need a culture change that goes with it. There are also dilemmas such as, the calls sometimes to lower the age of consent. How do we weigh that against greater risk? Do we give autonomy or protection? And some of these decisions are incredibly difficult because there are a lot of very grey areas. The United Nations Entity for Gender Equality, which is known as UN Women, have an aim that is working towards equality and empowerment of women. And it also it covers some of this aspect of child marriage, but moves on to another key concern, which is violence towards women. And I was looking at some of the data that they had gathered, and I feel this has taken a slightly darker turn, but it's very important. Globally, there's an estimated 736 million women who have been subject to physical or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner violence, or both, at least once in their life. That's a huge amount of women, and it represents about 30% of women who are 15 years of age or over in the world. That's frightening statistics. And the suggestion is that 16% of 15 to 24-year-olds have experienced some sort of partner or intimate violence in the last 12 months. And even if they've been in a relationship. Perhaps less surprising is that globally, violence against women disproportionately affects low and lower middle income countries and regions where choices are fewer because there isn't sufficient economic strength for women. The other worrying statistic was that in 2020, 81,000 women and girls were killed. Around 47,000, which is 58% of that original number, died at the hands of an intimate partner or family member. And I think this is where it all starts to feel a bit more real when you think that in the number of people we all know, maybe there's somebody we know who is hiding the fact that life is difficult for them, that they are suffering with some sort of domestic abuse. So I turned to the UK crime survey for the year ending March 2021. And if you have a look at that, nearly 1.5 million domestic abuse related incidents were reported. And of those, nearly 850,000 were recorded as domestic abuse crimes, forming 18% of all offences recorded during the year. And again, the concern to me is that the figures only represent the recorded crimes, not the prevalence. So we don't really know what the prevalence is. COVID worsened the number of offences because of the effects of lockdown, where people were cooped up for periods of time. And the worst areas for this in the UK were the North East and Yorkshire and Humberside. As a reminder, these are definitions of behaviours associated with domestic abuse. And I ought to say that domestic abuse also recognises children who, while they may not be the victim directly, they could see, hear, or be aware of domestic abuse happening in the family. I want to also acknowledge that sometimes men are the victims here, and all victims need protection. But when you look at the statistics, domestic homicides are 76% female and sexual offences 93% female. So I don't think we could argue that it is something that affects women particularly. The UN Women data suggests that there's almost a shadow pandemic because of the increase. They've been doing rapid gender assessments in different countries to try and find out a little bit more about how and why this is happening. Big data analysis in 8 Asian countries shows that internet searches related to violence against women and help seeking rose significantly during the lockdowns, using keywords such as violent relationship, bruises on face, domestic violence hotline. Apparently, the data shows that less than 40% of people seek help, and less than 10% of those seeking help appeal to the police for whatever reason. It also links to school-related gender-based violence, and it's a major obstacle to promotion of education for girls. Globally, 1 in 3 students aged 11 to 15 have been bullied by their peers at school at least once in the last month. Boys and girls are equally likely to experience bullying. Boys most likely to receive and experience physical bullying, but for girls it's more psychological and often about their body image or appearance. And often bullying is not done in person, it's done on social media. And I think we're all quite familiar with the examples of online abuse. And I think it forms a current challenge for schools, the law, life in general, and we've got to be aware that it's not solely towards women, but reflects a culture that disrespects many different groups of society. And I think thinking about what's been in the news the last couple of days, a young girl called Molly Russell who died a while ago, it's become very apparent that her interactions with social media played quite a large part in making her take actions which led to her death. A very sad thing to happen, and I'm sure not an isolated case. I decided to do an internet search on social media abuse of women, and it returned 491 million results. And these are just a few examples. There's acknowledgement, there's investigation, there's talk of action, but there aren't really any solutions offered. They tend to be what we do afterwards rather than how to stop it in the first place. And I feel that, you know, despite looking through pages and pages of these search results, if I had been looking for help, I wouldn't have felt very confident that I would find it. It seems to me that it's a priority, not just for women, but in general. But I think women are particularly vulnerable to this type of problem. The Office for National Statistics talks about, you know, any violence against women and girls can be lasting and significant. Can't help thinking that we don't really need analysis to tell us that. I think it probably speaks for itself. I found some other quotes from this particular ONS report, which incidentally was November 2021, so very recent. the quotes from people saying about suffering anxiety, having to take medication, self-esteem was damaged, being in a state of panic, suicidal thoughts. It's not just physical. There's an air of real desperation in those quotes. And I feel that, you know, that they illustrate only too well where treatment of these are women in particular, where it can lead. However, I did find one quote which was praising the action of a police officer who acknowledged that this person was a victim and understood her. And I think the key words here are that he could clearly see that he understood, that he treated her as an equal, and he was respectful. And I think that goes back to, you know, things that we raised at the beginning, that just provide women with an equal opportunity. In order to improve matters, the sort of actions that we need to be taking, particularly, this is back to the UN Women, it's about trying to make sure that there are support systems in place, that women in leadership positions are supported, that public awareness is scaled up, and that we try to make information and communication more accessible. What it's talking about is a culture change, and that's always very difficult because people have varying opinions and we need to respect people's opinions, but I think there are some things which we can't accept and shouldn't accept. So what's UN Women doing? Well, they're providing key data, particularly on the impacts of COVID-19. They're doing rapid gender assessment surveys in 13 countries. They're promoting shelters, women's organisations, justice and policing, and they're trying to provide funding, helplines, legal support for women. They're trying to work with tech companies like Google and Facebook to try and make social media a safer place to be. And as I said at the beginning, trying to sort of think about some of the more personal ways of looking at this. What can we do? We can support organisations that help women at risk. We can lend our support to women who are in leadership or public service roles. We can be vigilant and try to notice when women need help. We need to support equal pay and conditions, but I have to say this caveat, we need equality for men too, to facilitate women in the workplace, because if women are to be helped, then perhaps men need proper paternity leave, for example. And I don't want this to sound as if everything should be provided for women, because it is about everybody working together in a productive and respectful way. One of the things that we might support in our own life is sharing household management or childcare. I know in my own family that my son is very actively involved in childcare and does it gladly, but it really is a plate spinning exercise for a lot of families with young children. And maybe the support that's needed is to make sure that there is some sort of parity in terms of the support that's available for women and men here. We've also got the Equalities Act, which talks about all protected characteristics, not just gender, but it does underpin the sort of moral compass that we need. And And if we go back to the quote from Nehru at the beginning of this presentation, we need to educate boys as well. If we're going to change the culture, we need to, we can't just say, let's educate girls. We need to look at what we are doing in terms of helping boys to understand that it's beneficial for everybody to have this more balanced society. Coming to the end then of this, of my rather interesting time spent looking more closely at some of these issues, it has caused me some concerns, because I thought, blimey, I didn't know that, or it was worse than I expected. But then there is also some very good work going on, and we need to perhaps look at some of the high profile work that we can support and encourage people in the public eye to take on some of these issues. I mentioned the Queen Consort earlier, and I know that she's done some very good work to support different groups to help women who have been sufferers of domestic abuse and that sort of thing. And I think we need to try to find causes like that we can support, that will help to make changes, in the same way that you know, we know that there are people who are campaigning about mental health support and other things, but I think there are things that we can do personally maybe that can support all this. I was looking for a final thought, and it occurred to me that I need to just go back to where I started. In 2011, the Queen attended a British Commonwealth Summit, and the theme of that summit was Women as Agents of Change. And this quote is the Queen's response in her opening speech to the theme of the summit. And she said, "It reminds us of the potential in our societies that is yet to be fully unlocked, and encourages us to find ways to allow girls and women to play their full part. We must continue to strive in our own countries and across the Commonwealth together to promote that theme in a lasting way beyond this year." And I think that's as good a sentiment to end on. And I hope that some of the things that I've raised, even though they are a little dark, will help us to perhaps find a way to play our part.
Thank you, Jane. I let that run on. We're well into our hour.
Oh, I'm sorry. Have I rambled? Oh, I have rambled on, haven't I?
But I hope that people who are participating in this found that a fascinating walk through lots of things. Are any of you wishing to ask questions or make comments? Just unmute yourself and shout out.
Thank you so much. Even though this topic and the reality seems to be like a bit depressive, to see people who wants to make this world beautiful for all of us makes me more happy and hopeful. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear from your perspective there. Did you say you were involved in health studies or medical work?
Sorry, can you repeat again?
Are you involved in medical studies? Is that what you were doing?
Yeah, I'm a medical student, yes.
Okay, brilliant. Because it seems to me that while Jane was talking there was in England, we talk about physical, mental, social and emotional health.
Yeah.
And if you wrap gender into there and you talk about sustainable well-being, then perhaps the physical one is about your economic empowerment. you're physically able to live and develop. Your emotional one is to do with all the kind of issues around the social media and the roles and rights that you have. And of course, that impacts on the mental. So there's a huge connectivity, I think, within these things and the medical professions. Mark, I'm going to ask in terms of your background in media, to what extent do you think that the things have changed in media over time with women?
I think media's had a big impact in many ways, some good and some bad. When we look at social media, I think Jane's pointed out how nasty it can be, and it can really be nasty, because obviously people can hide behind the internet through Facebook and everything else. But there's also a lot of positive things, I think, about media, because it's allowed certain people to have voices that otherwise might not have done. May not be through social media itself in terms of the internet or Facebook, but it could be through video. Some people, some of the best presenters of outstanding thoughts have been ladies and women who are brilliant at getting a point over. And I think we shouldn't miss that. In fact, we should encourage it. I know there are some companies that even use video within the workplace for people to go and sit down into a cubicle, have their thoughts, have their say, which is a lot easier than it used to be, where particularly ladies were suppressed from their saying things. So in many ways, I do think it's got good and bad. And like Jane said, it's such a wide and broad area now, in particular with the nastiness that's going on. It's not controllable to a large degree. You can have all the policies in the world, and you can have all the laws and legislation in the world, but of course, we all are affected by comments that are derogatory, that bring a state of emotional unpleasantness, and in fact, it can go a lot darker to suicidal and other thoughts, where people have certainly followed routes, unfortunately, regrettably. So we've just got to be conscious of that as people and as businesses and as people, and all we can try to do is to educate the best way we can.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you for saying that, Mark, because I know that I focused on the social media thing as a sort of an adjunct to domestic violence, because I think it is, it's one of those sort of things that coercive behaviours and that sort of thing, it enables that type of thing more easily. But there's always something on the other side of the coin, and I think we need to focus on the things that we can do to promote that other side, that is the better side. And maybe that's one of the things that social media could be developed for, because there are support groups and that sort of thing that we can access remotely like that, which at least provides an access and a touch point, doesn't it?
Right, Jane, absolutely.
Suffering or in
I think everything, particular media, is about education. It's about empowering young people, boys and girls, at the positive side, because at the moment it seems they use it as in some cases, more negative, which is a tragedy and a shame. But I think at a lot earlier age now, particularly in the educational sectors, in combination with good parenting, we should be teaching people how to use it for positiveness, not just for learning, but for saying and presenting and having arguments and learning on a worldwide basis. As you all know, I work within a community environment, and it's been brilliant to talk to other communities right across the world, which wouldn't be able to do, quite simply. And that includes brilliant ladies, brilliant women who are doing some smashing things, and we can share best practices. So we don't need to look at it as totally negative, like you say, Jane. There's lots of great stuff, but I wish we had younger sort of set of values that came through the schools, through the families, because if the families don't support it, then I'm afraid these people can just sit on these things all night long, see all the bad stuff, all the gutter press and all of the horrid things, and it can be taken in by it and influenced.
Okay, I'm gonna roll it up here, but I'd like a bit of advice, please. I've got a granddaughter who is 5 in a week's time. And if I were to find a role model for her as a 5-year-old, who do you think I should point her towards looking at? And if she was then 10 years old, is there another one?
Good question.
And of course, if that's the case, we'll take your suggestions and we might even do something on the screen with them. Anyone
It's
from
quite
London there?
interesting.
Oh, sorry?
It's quite interesting, Clive, because I think some of the most powerful ladies, including Elizabeth II, were brilliant at using the media, brilliant at saying things at the right time. And I would definitely use her as a role model without question.
Right. Any from Webster's from London?
No, I was just going. Oh, what? You wanted an example? Is that what you were saying?
Have you got one?
Well, only not somebody I know by name, but when we did the Western Ghats, we had a young girl who was a spokesperson for them. So we had all the villagers, indigenous villages. There was how many was there? There was over 40 in the where they wanted to be outside, so they were in the forest, and we had the media, and the young girl spoke up on behalf of the villagers at one point, which was pretty impressive, I thought.
Yeah.
Saying how important education was to her. So it's
Very good.
Impressive.
Yeah. David?
I think it's very hard to provide a role model for a 5-year-old that they would understand.
Yeah.
And
I think there's some of the movies around at the moment that my granddaughter's well into.
Yeah. Maybe those aren't the ones that you're wanting her to on then. But I think you're right about role models and finding the right ones. And also, you know, I've got grandsons of a similar age. I've 3 and 6, and I think it's equally important for them to see girls and women in a way that, you know, they can learn from them, and they can be equally role models for them. You know, one of the examples might be the Lionesses for Football Mad Boys, because I think I was almost I was almost turned, if you like. I actually watched some of the football when the ladies' football was on. I'd got a little bit stale with the histrionics of some of the Premier League games, and to see these ladies showing lots and lots of skill, great sportsmanship, and exciting football, you sort of think, well, actually, boys, have a good look at that.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've reached the time for our recording to stop. Just to say, to wrap this up, thank you, Jane, for a wide-ranging and thorough exploration of SDG 5. There's dimensions to this that perhaps we hadn't already thought about, but certainly the challenge in this in terms of researching and presenting is good for us all to hear from you. So many thanks again, and I'll end the recording now.